Hi everyone, Marian here. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to something you guys probably have never seen before on my channel, which is a recorded Zoom call. So as you guys know, we are all at our own homes and just waiting out this health crisis that's going on and just praying for the best. And if you guys have been following me on Instagram, I've been sharing that I had planned to film this Ask Me Anything with Rabbi Berkowitz that is here. And we thought we had all the time in the world to film it. We were all scheduled to go this week, but as things would happen, we did not, but we decided we wanted to do it anyways. So I'm very thankful to Rabbi Berkowitz for being willing to do this via Zoom. And we apologize in advance if there's any audio or visual, whatever, but we thought the most important thing was to just share with you guys at this time and to be here with you guys at this time. So the comments section is open if anyone has more questions, and any resources or links that we mention, I'll put in the description bar as well. And you can always reach out to us also if you are struggling. So we're going to start off by I'll let Rabbi Berkowitz introduce himself. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the coronavirus and just what prayers we can say at this time and kind of what to make of all of this. And then we'll jump into the questions that we were going to ask before, which definitely still apply at this time because they were kind of universal anyways. So I'll start off. Rabbi Berkowitz, you guys may remember him from my Simchat Torah, This is a Torah in Real Life video, but it's here again, and take it away, Rabbi Berkowitz.
Thanks, Marian. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here virtually with you. This is one of the things that we're all getting used to during this new time, is how we're going to maintain our connections with people and make sure that we're still getting that sort of sustenance that we need from being with other people, even if it means being with people virtually and not necessarily side by side. So glad to be here, and I hope that others enjoy this opportunity as well. So thanks for having me, and anything that, where you want me to start off with?
So I want to start off with a prayer. Is there a daily prayer we could say? Is there something meaningful at this time? I actually saw this really interesting article that hundreds of years ago, people would have Jewish weddings in a graveyard. Like, people were just desperate to try something. So I don't want to go to that extreme, but is there a prayer that we could say at this time?
It's a great question. So, of course, Judaism has, I would say, sort of two different approaches to prayer, generally speaking. There's the more rigid, structural, 3 opportunities for prayer each day, plus an extra one on Shabbat. And during the course of those services, there are prayers that we offer that speak to some very specific needs. And then there are also prayers that I think have room for interpretation, to be opened up to think about them much more broadly. During a time like this, certain communities are also adding to their prayers and finding either prayers that come from the words that we use during the high holidays on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and at other times of the year when we're sort of in a moment of extreme sort of care, worrying about one another, worrying about our own well-being, and trying to, and seeking, I would say, that relationship with God, with the divine, with something greater than ourselves, especially when it sometimes feels like some of the power has been stripped away from us during a time of uncertainty like this. So one of the prayers that I think has taken on particularly important meaning for me over the past few weeks, as this has developed more and more, and as it sort of becomes more of a dysregulator for those of us who are trying to go about our daily lives, is the prayer that we call Hashkiveinu. It's a prayer that's typically recited at night in the Mariv, the evening service, but I don't think it would be inappropriate to offer a prayer like that at other times as well. So I'll just share with you, I'll read it in the English for everybody. If you were to search online, Hashkiveinu, I'm sure you could find, we can upload different links. Excellent, so that people can see the actual prayer itself. And this is how it goes. It's in English. Help us, O God, to lie down in peace and awaken us again to life. Spread over us your shelter of peace. Guide us with your good counsel. Save us because of your mercy. Shield us from enemies and pestilence, from starvation, sword, and sorrow. Remove the evil forces that surround us. Shelter us in the shadow of your wings, O God, who watches over us and delivers us, our gracious and merciful ruler. And it goes on from there a little bit. And so if we look at sort of what is the prayer actually asking for? What is it that we are sort of demanding of God in this moment when we read Hashkiveinu, and we read this really at night? So the sun is going down. There's uncertainty about as we go into the evening, is the sun going to rise again tomorrow? And of course, we know that it will, but we still sometimes feel that kind of uncertainty in our lives. And this prayer is asking God to step into a world that is sometimes chaotic, that is sometimes uncertain, that sometimes lays things at our feet that are really challenging. And the prayer asks that God support us during this time and provide the comfort that we need to get through difficult moments like this. So I think for me, it's a good reminder that I'm not alone, that I have hopefully something in my spiritual life to turn to, that I have people to turn to, and that I have my faith to turn to in difficult and trying times like these.
Yeah, actually, when you said that, it reminded me, I think I've mentioned before that I like to do what I call Jewish meditation, which is to just meditate on one line of prayer. And the line that works for me is the last line of the Adon Olam, which is Adonai li velo ira. God is with me, I'm not afraid. So sometimes even just that little feeling like that, even if you feel so alone, that at least God is with you in these times. So speaking of God and where is God, a lot of good people are dying. That's just the reality. Many good people have died because of this illness going around, and a lot of people bring up this, well, why? Does God pick and choose? Are our prayers not strong enough? How do we kind of make sense of good things happening to bad things happening to good people?
I think that this is a question that Judaism has wrestled with for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. If you look in the Torah, and then you look later on in the Hebrew Bible, and then as time progresses in more of the rabbinic writings that came out much later, you can see that this idea, the way that Judaism understands that question, why do bad things happen to good people, it sort of changes throughout history. One of the things that I think was sort of a really key moment in shaping our current theology on that probably is what we went through in the middle of the 20th century with the Shoah, with the Holocaust, a moment in which millions of people who were entirely innocent paid the ultimate sacrifice with their lives. And so we asked the question, why do bad things happen to good people? For me, the way that I think about it in my personal theology is that God doesn't necessarily, or I would say more definitively than that, God does not punish us individually by sending these things upon us. When we get sick, when we have an accident and something happens to us, when these things happen to our life, that is not to be understood as God's way of punishing us. And instead of thinking about the question in terms of why does God allow that to happen, instead I like to think about it differently and to suggest that God has provided us with a system of Jewish life, with rituals, with ways of connecting to one another, with customs and with practices that help us to get through those difficult times. Part of being a human being is that sometimes great things happen in our lives and we get to celebrate and enjoy being with each other. And other times we're faced with really complicated, difficult circumstances like the one that we're in right now. And in moments like this, we can turn to Judaism not because we think that Judaism is going to offer an answer as to why, but I think instead Judaism is going to offer us an answer in terms of the question, how? How do I manage to get through this difficult time? How do I respond when such horrible things are happening in the world? And there are a variety of ways to do that. I'll speak in a very general sense when it comes to people who fall ill. Judaism has a practice of reciting a prayer called the Misha Berach. One, we implore God to bring blessing upon those who are suffering from an illness, not only to heal them, but to also give counsel and advice and to help give wisdom to those who are entrusted with their care. So we're praying not only for those who are ill, but we also pray right now for doctors, for physicians, for medical experts, for right now, frankly, our political leaders to be able to make the decisions that they're being called to make that are very complicated and challenging. So Judaism, I don't know if it answers authoritatively or definitively or with any sense of comfort the answer as to why do these things happen, but absolutely our tradition gives us a mechanism through which we can answer the question of how do these happen, how to respond when these things happen, what can we do to support one another, how can we be by each other's side, what are the things that we can do, as prayer is one of those options that we just talked about, what are those things that we can do to help us navigate through these really difficult times.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of the Purim story, seeing as the holiday of Purim just passed. And we talked about, where's God in the Purim story, because his name isn't mentioned. And one of the answers is that when people do good things, and like Mordecai and Esther and their heroic efforts, that's where God comes in. So God isn't in the illness or the recovery. He's in, the hearts and hands of the doctors and the people that are going out and getting groceries for the elderly. That's where you can find God. So to me, that's a comforting thought as well. So thank you, Rabbi, for talking about such a serious and hard topic. I know that is very healing and comforting to so many people who have watched this or will be watching this. Let's move on to something a little more fun, which is our other questions that we had lined up. So I'm going to get those now. Okay, so the first question I got, I'm choosing it first because it was the most popular one. And I had a lot of people ask me what to do if they feel like in their hearts they are being called towards Judaism and they want to convert. And I think that a lot of people ask this because maybe there's not so many resources where they live or people that they know to talk to. So they've been reaching out to me and saying, what do I do if I want to convert?
It's a great question. I'm not that surprised that it's such a popular one. I think many people in the world that we live in are seeking spirituality, are seeking a connection to a community and to a faith tradition. Judaism happens to be, of course, one that's available to many. And I think the fact that Jews now live sort of all over America and in many places throughout the world, more people have been exposed to some of the things that Judaism has to offer for spiritual seekers. And I think that it's wonderful for people who are considering it as an option. I would say primarily the best thing to do if you're considering or curious about conversion to Judaism, there's two different things. I'd encourage you to read. There is a lot out there on the internet. We can give you some helpful tips. I can offer some helpful tips and guidance of what you should look through and what are some great resources to be looking at. There are a couple of books that are out there that are available that people can explore if they're thinking of conversion. But the more important thing beyond just reading is to find a local Jewish community. Most local Jewish communities will have a rabbi or some sort of a spiritual leader that is there for you. Ultimately, if one was to choose to go through with conversion, the mechanism through which to do that is to learn with a rabbi and study with a rabbi who can then bring you through that process. The reason I said find your Jewish community and not just a rabbi is because I think part of converting is not just doing something that's for you in isolation. When you convert to Judaism, one of the things that we teach people is you're not just taking on a particular faith tradition or a belief system, you're joining a people. You're joining a community, and once you are Jewish, you are considered a full member of that community in all ways. We don't differentiate between one who converted and one who was born into Judaism, and especially nowadays when most people, even if they were raised Jewish, sort of have an option to decide what their Jewish engagement is going to look like. We encourage everyone to be a part of the community in a way that is meaningful for them. So I would say the first thing to do is to seek out a Jewish community. Through that community, try to seek a spiritual leader, a rabbi, a teacher, somebody who's going to help you navigate through that process, and be prepared for a really transformative process of learning and experiencing things that are probably very different than what you may have been exposed to before.
Awesome. And for the record, anyone who has converted or is thinking about converting is welcome here. I get asked that a lot. Like, is it okay? I'm thinking about it. I'm like, yes, everyone is welcome here. Even if you're not Jewish, especially if you're not Jewish, everyone is welcome here.
I would say that in many synagogues also and Jewish community centers, if you walk in and as long as, you don't have to be embarrassed to tell people, I'm here because I'm seeking Judaism, I'm here because I'm curious. I know that in my community, we are very welcome to those who are spiritual seekers, and I hope that others are welcoming to those individuals as well.
Definitely. Okay, my next question is the one I thought was most interesting, and that is, can good people have bad thoughts? And I think we all know everyone has bad thoughts. So how do we make sense of this? What do you think about that?
It's a good question. Can good people have bad thoughts? So one of the things that I always emphasize about Judaism is, on the whole, Judaism concerns itself more with practice than with thought, or concerns itself more with deed than with what's going on in the back of your head. So, if for example, sometimes we have difficulty praying. Sometimes the words on the page don't speak to us. Sometimes we find ourselves having a really hard time connecting with it in the moment. Whatever we're going through or dealing with might make it challenging for us to pray. Maybe even we are questioning whether or not there is anybody listening to those prayers. Judaism says that's fine, but you should still pray. Go ahead and say those words and give thought to those things and struggle. That's what it means, that the word in Hebrew to be for Israel, to be a Jewish person, Yisrael, means to struggle with God, to wrestle with God. Most of Judaism in its development has always been a back and forth, a dialogue, a series of challenging questions, trying to figure out who we are and what we do. And so it's perfectly acceptable if sometimes from here and there we have thoughts that looking back on it, we say, well, that wasn't a nice thing to think. But to be able to name that and be cognizant of that and aware of that, that's okay. It doesn't mean that we're a bad person. Judaism acknowledges that we have free will. And so we have two things within us. One called the Yetzer Hara and one called the Yetzer HaTov, the inclination to do evil and the inclination to do good. And we learn from early rabbinic literature that we need the Yetzer Hara. We need that inclination to sometimes push us and challenge us and put us in difficult positions. But the reason we need that is such that the Yetzer HaTov can then come and temper that, so that our inclinations to do good and our inclinations to do bad are balanced one with the other. But what's important is what you wind up doing in the end in terms of your actions. So if you think you're going to do something or you would like to do something and ultimately you recognize, you know what, that's probably not the right thing to do, what you've been able to do is conquer, we say. That's the word that's used in the Hebrew, to conquer one's Yetzer Hara. You conquer your evil inclination, and in the end you wind up doing the right thing anyway. It's perfectly fine to have bad thoughts as long as we don't act upon them. Later traditions of Judaism, I'll mention, especially in the Musar tradition, which often is understood as Jewish ethics, does try to help people sort of train themselves to not have so many of those bad thoughts. And there's sort of a system of study that people can go through that helps them name those thoughts, recognize them, and then also spend time trying to do what we can in our day-to-day practice to set those thoughts aside and make sure we're focusing on good things and the things that matter most.
That sounds like a good video topic.
It could be.
Good thoughts. I like that one.
Yeah.
So I like that. You can wrestle with God, but you don't need to beat yourself up about it.
That's right.
Okay. My next question is, this is a fun one. Do you feel a bond with other clergy members? And is there sort of like a fraternity with all the rabbis?
That's a great question. There are professional groups of rabbis that get together. So I'm a conservative rabbi because I was ordained by the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City. And by nature of being ordained from that institution, I'm part of a professional group of conservative rabbis. And then where people live, we are very fortunate here in Washington, D.C. We have a very vibrant and active Washington, D.C. Board of Rabbis. Colleagues from all across the denominational spectrum that get together on a regular basis for learning and for study. And whether some of us are congregational rabbis, some of us are educators in the community, some do things that are quite out of the box and different, and yet we all learn from one another and spend a significant amount of time bonding. You can imagine the amount of emails that we share with each other on a fairly regular basis.
Secret fantasy football league, you go bowling every Saturday night. We get it. Right?
I wish we did more things like that. We don't do enough social. We gather, when we are permitted to, unlike right now with what's going on, unfortunately, with coronavirus, but when we can, we do try to gather at least once a month, if not more, in a physical space together. Now we might have to do that differently, but there's certainly, I would say, not everybody would necessarily describe it as a calling to be necessarily Jewish clergy, but there's something about a desire to serve the community and to be a teacher. That's what the word rabbi really means. It means to be someone's teacher and to help guide them on a journey. And so I certainly share that with many of my colleagues, and in conversations with Christian and Muslim clergy as well. I think there is a shared sense of we chose this life because we want to serve the community. We want to help people find meaning both in the most joyous and beautiful times of their life, and also help give them comfort and sustenance during some of the most challenging.
Right. Speaking of Christianity, this brings me to another question, which is how to celebrate Christian holidays with family members or friends that celebrate without sort of crossing that line and celebrating them or observing them in a way that'd be contrary to what you should be doing as a good Jewish person.
It's a good question, especially because we know that so many families in the United States and around the world are interfaith families that even if one partner decides to convert to Judaism, that still means that they don't leave behind, but they have a large non-Jewish family that comes along with them. And for those of us who do exist in those spheres and try to balance that life, it can be very challenging at first. I think it's different for each family. Everybody needs to sort of decide where they're going to draw their line. But what I would say as a general guiding principle, and I would encourage this for everybody, is to keep open lines of communication and to be very honest with one another in a respectful and kind way. Just because we have chosen a different faith tradition perhaps than our families, or just because we've married into a different faith tradition, doesn't mean that we don't love and respect and care for our families and those who practice differently than us. What we have to do is be willing to tell somebody, this is where we're going to draw the line because this is what's important to me. And it's not because I don't respect you and it's not because I don't love you, it's because I have a particular vision for the way that me and my family are going to, the way that I'm going to observe Judaism, the way that my family is going to learn about their Judaism. And if we can engage in those conversations in a productive way, I think that would sort of take some of the difficulty and the strife out of these situations. By way of example, I even within my Jewish family have certain relatives who don't keep kosher. I do keep kosher. In my home very strictly, and even when we go out to eat in other places. And so when I spend time with my family and friends, I draw certain lines about what I'm going to eat and where I'm going to eat. And I've explained that to them and I've helped guide them through that. And everyone's going to draw the line in a slightly different place. And I encourage people to have the willingness to be open-minded and think these things through with their families. But we all sort of have to also be, on the one hand, flexible, and on this other hand, I would say, stay true to our values. Each one of us is going to have a different sort of attachment to our Jewish values, and we have to decide what's really important to us, and what are some things that we are going to either have to sacrifice or leave behind as we engage with non-Jewish family members and friends when we celebrate holidays and other gatherings together.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I know it's something that's easy to say, hard to do, but I think it's a good guiding principle. Okay, my next question that I got is, this is a really interesting one, but what I love about these questions is I asked people on Instagram for them, and I got the most fascinating and wide variety of questions. This question is, do you really want the Messiah to come?
Great question. So we were in Judaism, we refer to the Messiah in Hebrew as Mashiach. The understanding of the Jewish Mashiach, the Jewish Messiah, probably varies based on which Jewish text you are looking at. Some Jewish texts think about the notion of Messiah very literally. This is going to be a human being, that they're going to be brought into Jerusalem, that Elijah the prophet is going to herald the coming of this Messiah, and that person coming into the world is going to mean a massive sort of realignment or a massive change in what is currently the status quo of our society and the world in which we live. That, I would say, is sort of a literalist interpretation of the Messiah. And on the other hand, we have much more expansive and sort of metaphorical understandings of what it means when we reach what often is referred to in rabbinic literature as Yemot HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah. And instead of occupying ourselves with deciding who is the Messiah going to be and what are they going to be like and what are they going to do, we instead have conversations about what is it going to feel like, what's the world going to be like in which we live, what will define the period in which we believe the Messiah will be amongst us. So Obviously, there are some very basic elements of it will be a time of peace and not a time of war. It will be a time when people, especially the Jewish people, are gathered all together in the land of Israel. There's a very common understanding that the days when we reach the days of the Messiah, all Jewish people, whoever lived, who are currently living, whoever will be, will gather together once again in the land of Israel. Somehow the space will expand so that we can all fit there comfortably. But there are very different understandings of what it means for the Messiah to come. Do I personally want the Messiah to arrive? I feel very, very comfortable saying I would like the metaphorical Messiah to arrive, in the sense that I would love to have a world in which the world is filled with peace and understanding, in which everybody respects one another with kindness and compassion. I would love to see a world in which those are the values that are lived out. Some of the other elements, if you get into some of the specifics of the Messiah, there's also understandings that there's going to be sort of a great cataclysmic event before the Messiah actually arrives, and that could be filled with some things that are less desirable, things that are not things that we would necessarily pray for and look forward to.
Right.
So I guess it depends on which version of the Messiah you're hoping for, is the answer to my question.
I love that. I would say if you asked me 2 weeks ago if I wanted the Messiah, I would be like, actually, things are pretty good for me now. Like, I don't really want much disruption. And now it's like, I don't know, the world is in chaos. I'm praying for something. So it's just amazing how much has changed in just a few short amount of time, and how much it's changed. I mean, my faith, definitely. Okay, I have another God question for you, and that is, how do I talk to my preschooler or kids about God if I'm not sure that I believe in God myself?
So one of the things that I say to anybody who is trying to engage in a conversation with God, especially with somebody who's younger than them, or when you're talking to your kids about it, is to sort of explore with them. Be curious with them. When they pose a question to you, throw it back. Let them answer it. When they say to you, where is God? Ask them, where do you think God is, or where do you feel God? What kind? Sort of go with them into that place, and that could, I think, actually be extremely helpful for those who even struggle themselves with coming up with a theology of God. Theology and a belief in God is not static over the course of our lives. The kind of God that we teach to younger kids in nursery school is different than the kind of God that they eventually learn about when they either go to Jewish day school or when they go to a religious school in a congregation. And God willing, that will, of course, change again as they get older, because as we get older, when we have more mature understandings of the world, it makes sense that we learn more complicated and more mature understandings of God. Some people tell me, I don't believe in God. And I say, well, my first question to them is, what is the kind of God that you don't believe in? Because probably I don't believe in that God either. Like I said earlier, if you said I don't believe in a God that punishes people who do nothing wrong, I also don't believe in a God that punishes individual people. If you said to me you don't believe that God is a man who sits up in heaven on a throne with a beard, I also don't believe in that kind of a God. I believe in a God that impacts the world in ways that are both seen and unseen. I believe in a God that acts not outside of history and outside of the world, but through the hands of human beings. When we see people do wonderful things in the world and bring healing to each other and are there to support one another and do deeds of kindness to each other, that is an example of God's presence in the world. And so it doesn't have to be something as major as the splitting of the Red Sea in order to see God's hand in the world, God's metaphorical hand in the world. I think that there are other ways in which we can find a sense of spirituality and divinity in the world in which we live. And so when we're having conversations with our children and younger people about it, I would say explore those questions with them. Ask them what they think. And don't be afraid to offer what you think. And then I would say use it as a learning opportunity. There are many resources available online. I'll give a plug for a couple different websites. My Jewish Learning is an excellent resource with a variety of Jewish texts and essays and places that you can look to find out more information. There's a great website called thetorah.com, might be .org, thetorah.org or thetorah.com. And that is a wonderful resource that has essays written by academics, but also people who are not just academics. They're also deeply religiously engaged Jews. And so I think those are all great places to start. And if we're being challenged by our children to think more deeply about our theology, I think that is shouldn't be a scary moment. It should be a wonderful, beautiful moment of opportunity for us to engage deeper and think about what is it that we believe about God? What is it that we think about our attachment to Judaism, and especially the realm of the divine?
I love that. I remember once I was taking Max on a stroller walk and it was starting to rain. And he asked me, why is it starting to rain? And he's 3.5. So at first I was like, well, there's the clouds and I was like, God's making it rain. Little did I know that was much more of a difficult topic to get into than trying to explain atmospheric pressure and water. So anyways, my next question for you is a fun one. I'm going to answer it too. The question is, what is your favorite Jewish book? But I thought I'd add on, also, what's your favorite Jewish kids book? So if you could give both of those, and then I'll give mine.
Okay. My favorite Jewish book, I would say, one of the first things, so I was not, a little bit of background was that I was raised in a conservative Jewish household, but we weren't particularly religious. We weren't necessarily observant. We were very dedicated to our synagogue and regular attendees, but at home we weren't necessarily, we didn't practice every little ritual that nowadays I am much more concerned with practicing in my own home. But one of the first books that I read when I was starting to explore becoming more personally observant and religious on my own was Abraham Joshua Heschel's book, The Sabbath. It's very short. It's not that simple, but It's very short.
It's helping hold up.
Oh my God! You have it!
Right there.
The Sabbath, that was not rehearsed, everybody. As you can tell from my reaction. The Sabbath I'll let Marion say more about it, but one of my favorite books because the way that Heschel writes, Heschel was a brilliant rabbi, a real incredible thought leader of, I would say, all of Jewish life in the 20th century, no matter what denomination you ascribe to. Heschel's thinking, especially as it relates to God and Shabbat, were critical in sort of my formation of my theology and my understanding. One of the beautiful stories that I'll share that Heschel writes in The Sabbath it's a story that he's quoting from somewhere else in Jewish literature, but he quotes a story of a rabbi who was out, or may have been just a Jewish person who was out in his backyard walking around Saturday. And as he's walking around, he notices that his fence is in need of some repair. And technically, according to the laws of Shabbat, you're not allowed to fix and repair that fence on Shabbat. And as a result of thinking that, this gets back to what we talked about before, can you have bad thoughts? Not exactly, but you can have thoughts that influence your actions. The rabbi decided, the individual decided that because they even thought about repairing the fence on Shabbat, they never would. And they would leave that portion of the fence unfixed for all time. And that way, every time they walked by that fence, whether it was a Saturday or a Wednesday, they would remember the importance of Shabbat. And the importance that's sort of not named, that's not explicit in that text, is that Shabbat is a time that Heschel would say that we desist from trying to engage in the world in which we can manipulate things physically, and instead respect the sanctity of time. That Shabbat is this beautiful period in which we can step back from the world, in which we don't have to feel like we need to manipulate each and every little thing, in which we have to have control. It's a time that we learn how to give up a little bit of that control, and not only give it up, but feel that we are gaining something in giving that up. When we liberate ourselves from having to be attached to our cell phones or our computers or our TVs, you free up an incredible amount of time to connect with other human beings, and to connect with your family, to think more deeply about who it is that you are and what it is you want to accomplish in the world. And that's why the Sabbath, Abraham Joshua Heschel's book, was so influential for me.
Yeah, I love the Sabbath. I will say it's a hard book to read. It's not like an easy reading. It's sort of like a Shakespeare in the way he writes sometimes, but there's so much inspiring, amazing thought in each sentence of that book, which is why it's so small. So yeah, I am currently working my way through it, which is why it's here on my desk. I've been wanting to read it for years and have sort of picked it up, put it down many times. But each time I've picked it up, I've been again, inspired and influenced by it, but I haven't been able to sit and read the whole thing. So I'm sure you understand that. And anyone who's opened that book understands that.
And I'd say I'm not the kind of person who rereads books, but the Sabbath is a book that I reread every once in a while as sort of an opportunity to recharge and re-energize in terms of my affinity for celebrating Shabbat.
Yes. Okay, and your favorite kids' Jewish book?
Oh, children! That's so hard. So I'm the parent of a 1-year-old. So I'm just getting into the world of Jewish children's books. But even before I had a 1-year-old, there's that great song about the dinosaur celebrating Shabbat.
Dinosaur knocking at the door.
That dinosaur knocking at my door, and they turned it into, I don't know if it was a book first or a song first, but there's a wonderful book that goes along with it. And I think it sort of blends what I think are the key components and key ingredients for creating a Jewish household that, in the sense that it includes, we're going to talk seriously for a minute about celebrating Shabbat, about doing Jewish ritual, because those things tie us together as a family and as a people. And then the book also has an element of, we're going to have fun with this. We're going to do something silly. We're going to do something that brings joy. And that, to me, is really the beautyism of Judaism, is that we are deeply dedicated and connected with ritual, with things that we do day in and day out that try to connect us to our past, our present, and our future. And we do all of that, hopefully, with a deep sense of joy. And that's what sort of, that's why that book comes to mind when I think about what's one of my favorite things to read to kids.
I love that. I love that book too. We have it as well. Mine is actually from growing up, and that is All of a Kind Family. I love that series. It's a very, I think it's 80s, 70s or 80s. So I haven't read it to my kids yet. Not because it's from the 70s, but because it's more of like a chapter book, but I love that book. And then for little ones, we're loving the Sammy Spider series. My son absolutely loves Sammy Spider. Okay, and my last question for you, and by the way, if you guys are like, I wanted to ask you a question, definitely follow me on Instagram, because I'll always post on there if I'm going to do something like that. And also, again, feel free to, in the comments, write any questions you guys have. My last question is just, why did you become a rabbi? What was it in your life experience or in your heart that just drew you to this calling?
So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that I didn't grow up in a very religious household necessarily, but we were members of a conservative synagogue, and my parents were very dedicated to synagogue life. We were very much part of our Jewish community. We were there on a fairly regular basis for Shabbat and holidays, and for a variety of other events and activities throughout the week. And being surrounded by people who found Judaism to be joyful and engaging, something where we knew we had friends, we knew we had a community, we knew we had people to turn to. That was sort of my early exposure to what really made me so passionate about living a Jewish life. Why did I want to become a rabbi? Because I wanted to be able to give other people those same experiences. I want other people to be able to feel connected to their Jewish community. I want people to find personal meaning in their Judaism as they identify on their own, not only in the context of community. You know, we live in interesting times now where so much we are able to do on our own, and at the same time, we're all yearning to be part of a community. And I think that Judaism provides both of those spaces. How can I grow as an individual, and how do I grow with being supported by a larger Jewish community, whether that's a synagogue or a Jewish community center or any other form of communal Jewish life. And I wanted to do this because I want to help other people find the same joy in Judaism that I found. It's helped to transform my life, and I hope that it helps to transform other people's life in a positive way as well.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Berkowitz, for being here. I was just looking at my clock. We said we would make this a 15-minute video. I don't think we achieved that, but I think the questions and things we talked about today were too important to cut it off. So I apologize for anyone who were like, I don't have this kind of time. But if you made it to the end, let us know. Give this video a like. Right, I made it to the end in the comments section. Thank you guys so much for watching it. Thank you so much, Rabbi Berkowitz. We'll see you in the next one. And
thanks for having me.
Bye.